Okay, now let's talk a little bit about modal progression compared to tonal progression. We already said that in tonal music, there's a strong sense of direction, which often works by the circle of fifths. Okay, let's just have a little reminder here of what that works like. Example 17. Now let's listen to the same thing, but with just the chords, without the melody. As you can see, the harmony in this example, it works by the cycle of fifths, E, A, D, G, C. So that's about as strongly directed as it can get. And that's pretty much a classical tonal melody. Nothing very surprising about that. Modal progressions have this quality that because they're not focused on fifths to the same degree, they often sound less directed. They have a kind of floating feeling, which is sometimes quite nice, but in any case, it's different. And it's important to note that when you're writing modal harmony, of course, the chords you have will depend on the scale you're using, but in general, there tends to be more use of relationships other than the fifth. Let's just think about that for a second. If I have two chords a second apart, let's say G major to A minor, all the notes in the chords have changed. Schoenberg calls that a super strong progression. All the notes get displaced. If I have two chords a third apart, only one note changes. Schoenberg calls that a weak progression because there's not much change. Fifth progressions, as we know, have the acoustically strong interval of the fifth and the bass and have two notes change. So they're sort of a good compromise between the two. In modal harmony, we'll often hear more second and third progressions than we would in tonal harmony. Let's listen to example 18. Now listen to the harmony alone for example 18. These second and third related chords sound a little bit like linear harmony that we were talking about last time. They work more by voice leading than by strong tonal direction, but they can still be very convincing. When I look at those chords in example 18 played without the melody, we see A minor to G major, that's a second relationship, G major to E minor, third relationship, E minor to D minor, second relationship, D minor to C major, second relationship. And that is what gives this particular example a much less tonal feeling to it. That's why it feels more modal in general. Now let's listen to our third example, example 19. You'll see that in this example, the beginning of the example has various third relationships, and because of the third relations, it's very quiet. Only at the very end does the tonic dominant axis become clear, with the 5-1 at the end. This is often typical of modal writing, that during the piece you'll often have whole sections where the music feels like it's rather floating, and the direction might only become clear right at the end. This particular kind of harmony, where there's a modal flavor during the piece, but ultimately a rather tonal cadence, is very common in lots of 20th century music. For example, Fauré, Ravel, Poulenc, Nielsen, Sibelius, Benjamin Britten. All these composers have a strong modal quality to their writing, but they still use tonal cadences, but in a less rigid way. And this brings up an interesting subject. Tonality and modality are not entirely separate things. They're related to each other. Modality, in fact, can be quite tonal in the sense that it has a tonal goal, a tonic, but just it doesn't move as clearly toward the tonic as tonality does, but it doesn't mean it has no tonic. Now a few words about tonality in general. By tonality, I don't necessarily mean major minor, but I do mean the sense that one note becomes home. It feels like that's where we're heading. And when we're somewhere else, we feel like we're not at home. It creates a kind of tension, and as the classical composers have shown us, that can be very useful for the form, creating a sense of large-scale voyaging or traveling away from home. with a sense of tension and then finally coming home with a sense of resolution. Now, there's an interesting thing about this. For example, there are pieces in the classical repertoire which last half an hour, or even in the case of opera, several hours, and they don't always finish in the same key they started in. So although theory would have us believe that the tonic is home all the time, there are cases, and I'm thinking particularly of several operas, where the beginning and the end aren't the same. And in fact, for people who don't have perfect pitch, nobody will notice. As long as the tonic at the end is strongly affirmed and there's a sense that it's final, nobody's going to remember whether it's the same tonic we had 3 hours ago at the beginning of Act 1. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. Of course, in most classical music, even large pieces, the center of tonality is consistent. If the piece starts in A, it will finish in A. If it starts in G, it'll finish in G. But nonetheless, the sense of that we can play with this feeling of resolution and tension gives us a lot of interesting formal possibilities. Tonality has advantages. One huge advantage of tonality is the feeling of tension and release. And that's an enormous advantage when you're trying to make your piece interesting and the piece is more than just a few moments long. Creating a sense of long-term tension keeps the listener involved in almost exactly the same way that a police thriller keeps you interested by not giving you the answer of who done it until the end. You're kept on the edge, on the cliff if you want, in the same way that not going back to the tonic can keep you away from home and in tension, in a state of tension in the music. Another advantage of tonality is it adds focus. The music feels like it has a specific place that's more central than somewhere else. And the last advantage is direction. Again, that's a very good way to keep the listener involved if the music has a strong feeling that it's aimed at something particular. We can extend the notion of tonality to use modality, various modes, in addition or instead of classical major and minor modes. We can use these progressions by second and thirds, or we can use other exotic modes. The point here is that there are many degrees of tonality. It's not yes or no, it's a matter of how much, ranging from the mildest gravitational pull to absolutely potent direction, which feels unavoidable. There are some very interesting examples of tonal ambiguity in some 20th century music. A good example, if you'd like to see how that works, is Nielsen's Fifth Symphony, the first movement. It starts off with just a tremolo between two notes. It's not clear what key it's in, and even when the harmony comes in below it, it's still not clear what key it's in. The whole movement sort of wanders around without really settling down until the very end after a very, very dramatic climax. And the tonal ambiguity and the fact that it never settles down is a very big part of that climax. I highly recommend that piece. It's beautiful modal harmony using tonality in a very imaginative and unusual way. That's the end of the second lesson.